If you don't have enough money, maybe you shouldn't be buying that kind of milk. The words landed louder than they should have, sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the grocery store. And suddenly, every sound seemed to disappear except the faint clink of coins trembling in Hannah Blake's hand as she stood frozen at register 4. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow over everything, making the scene feel harsher, more exposed, as if there was nowhere to hide, and Hannah could feel it. The weight of eyes on her back, the quiet impatience of the line behind her, the subtle shift in the cashier's expression as the total blinked on the screen again, unchanged. $32.68. Hannah swallowed, her throat dry, and looked down at the small pile of quarters, dimes, and nickels spread across the counter, counting them again even though she already knew the truth, already felt it settling in her chest like a slow, sinking stone. She was short, not by much, not enough to matter to most people, but enough to stop everything. Enough to make her stand here, exposed, holding up a line of strangers who had places to be, people to meet, lives that didn't revolve around scraping together loose change just to feed a baby. I just need a second, she said softly, her voice barely carrying, as she reached into her worn purse, fingers brushing against nothing but a folded receipt and a nearly empty wallet. Behind her, someone sighed, loud, deliberate, and another voice muttered something under their breath that she couldn't quite make out, but didn't need to. The meaning was clear enough. Hannah's cheeks burned, heat rising up her neck as she kept her eyes down, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, focusing instead on the can of baby formula sitting just inches away, as if looking at it long enough might somehow make the numbers change. It was the only kind her son could keep down. The pediatrician had said so after the third sleepless night in a row, after the crying that wouldn't stop, after the tiny body in her arms had trembled from discomfort she couldn't fix. She had tried the cheaper ones. They hadn't worked. This one did. And that was all. That mattered. Her phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket, the vibration sharp against her hip, and for a moment she hesitated before pulling it out, her hands still unsteady as the screen lit up with a video call. The babysitter. Hannah's heart jumped, a flicker of panic cutting through the humiliation as she answered, turning slightly away from the counter. The image that filled the screen made her breath catch. A small, flushed face, tiny fists waving, the sound of soft, desperate crying coming through the speaker even though the volume was low. "He's been like this for 20 minutes, the babysitter said, her voice tight with concern. "I think he's hungry again, Hannah." Hannah pressed her lips together, nodding quickly even though her chest felt like it was closing in. "I'm almost there," she whispered, her voice breaking just enough that she had to clear her throat. I'm getting his formula right now." She ended the call before the babysitter could say anything else, before the sound of her baby's cries could carry any further, before anyone else could hear it and connect the dots between the woman struggling at the register and the child waiting at home. But it was too late. The silence around her had shifted. There was a different kind of attention now, sharper, more focused, and Hannah could feel it without turning around. The cashier cleared her throat gently, glancing at the screen again. "You're about $4 short," she said, not unkindly, but loud enough for the people nearby to hear. $4. Hannah closed her eyes for a brief second, steadying herself, then opened them again and reached for the formula, her fingers tightening around the smooth metal can. "It's okay," she said quietly, forcing the words out even as they scraped against her pride. I'll put it back." Her hand moved, slow and reluctant, as if every inch it traveled away from the counter cost her something she couldn't afford to lose, and for a moment, it felt like the entire store was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Hannah's fingers tightened around the can for just a second longer, like she was trying to memorize its weight before. She slowly placed it back on the counter, the soft metal tapping against the surface sounding louder than it should have in the quiet that had settled around her. And for a moment she just stood there, staring at it, as if hoping someone might say something different, as if the total might magically change, but it did not, and the silence behind her shifted again, no longer just impatient, but edged with something sharper, something colder. And then a woman's voice broke through it, low but not low enough. "Unbelievable," she said, followed by a faint chuckle from someone else. And Hannah felt it, every word, every glance, pressing against her like a weight she could not push back against, and she forced herself to move, to gather the few coins she had scattered across the counter, each one clinking as she picked it up, her hands slower now, heavier. Like even this small action had become difficult under the gaze of strangers who had already decided what kind of person she was. Someone who could not afford what she needed, someone who did not belong in this line, in this moment, in this place. "Next customer, please," the cashier said gently, but the words still felt like a dismissal, like a closing door, and Hannah nodded without looking up, clutching her purse close to her side as she stepped away from the register, her movements careful, controlled, like if she moved too fast everything might fall apart completely, and as she turned, she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflective surface of the refrigerated section across the aisle, her hair pulled back in a rushed knot, her coat worn at the edges, her face pale with exhaustion, and for a split second she barely recognized the person staring back at her, because she remembered a different version of herself, one who used to walk into places like this without counting every dollar twice, without calculating what she could sacrifice just to afford something as basic as milk. She took a step forward, then another, trying to leave before the tightness in her chest turned into something worse, something she could not hold back. But the line had already shifted, people moving past her, brushing shoulders without apology, their conversations resuming as if nothing had happened, as if she had simply been a brief inconvenience in their day, and maybe that was all she was now, a delay, a problem to step around, and the thought settled deeper than she expected, making her grip tighten around her purse until her knuckles turned pale. Her phone buzzed again, another call, and she did not need to look to know who it was, and this time the sound of it felt urgent, insistent, like time itself was pressing against her, reminding her that every second she stood here without that formula was another second her baby was waiting, crying, needing something she had promised to bring, and the promise felt heavier now, almost unbearable, because she had failed it, even if just for this moment, and that realization hit harder than anything anyone in that store could have said. She moved faster now, heading toward the exit, her steps quick but uneven, her mind racing through options that did not exist, calculations that did not add up, until she reached the sliding doors and the cold air outside brushed against her face, sharp and grounding. But it did nothing to ease the tightness in her chest, nothing to quiet the sound of that earlier voice echoing in her mind, telling her she should not have been there in the first place. And for a brief moment, she stopped just outside the store, her shoulders rising and falling as she tried to steady her breathing, her eyes closing as she pressed her lips together, willing herself not to break down right there in the parking lot, not where anyone could see, not where she would have to carry that weight too. But even as she stood there, trying to hold herself together, she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted inside that store, something she did not fully understand yet, like a moment had passed that was not finished, like someone had seen more than she intended to show, and she had no idea that just a few steps behind her, someone had not moved on at all. The cold air outside should have helped, but it did not really, and Hannah barely made it 3 steps into the parking lot before her phone rang again, louder this time in the quiet open space, and she answered immediately, her fingers fumbling just slightly as she pressed the screen to her ear. "I am on my way," she said quickly, before the other person could even speak, but the babysitter's voice came through anyway, strained now, more urgent than before. "Hannah, he is not calming down. I tried everything. He keeps pulling away from the bottle." And in the background, the soft crying had turned sharper, more desperate, the kind of sound that did not just ask for attention but demanded it, and Hannah closed her eyes for a second, pressing her free hand against her forehead as if she could steady herself through sheer force. "He needs the formula I told you about, the one in the blue can. It is the only one that works," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "The others upset his stomach. You remember what happened last time." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make her chest tighten further, before the babysitter spoke again, softer now, almost apologetic. "I remember, but we are out. Hannah, there is nothing left here." And those words settled heavily, heavier than anything that had happened inside the store, because this was not about strangers or looks or whispered comments. This was about the small life waiting for her, depending on her, trusting her without knowing any of this, and Hannah swallowed hard, her throat tightening as she forced herself to respond. I know, I know, I need a few more minutes. But even as she said it, she knew she did not have a plan, no extra cash, no backup, nothing that could magically fix what had just happened, and the reality of that pressed in from all sides, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. She ended the call slowly this time, lowering the phone as the line went quiet. And for a moment she just stood there, the sounds of the parking lot faint around her, a car door slamming somewhere in the distance, tires rolling over pavement. But all of it felt far away compared to the echo of her baby's cries still ringing in her ears, and she tightened her grip on her purse again, her mind racing through possibilities that all ended the same way, with her coming up short, with her walking back into that store she had just left, facing those same eyes, those same voices, asking for something she had already failed to get, and the thought alone made her chest tighten again, a sharp, almost physical resistance building inside her. She turned slightly, glancing back toward the glass doors of the store, the bright lights inside making everything look clearer, more defined, and for a second she imagined herself walking back in, picking up that same can, standing in that same line, hoping for a different outcome. But hope did not change numbers, and numbers were all that mattered right now, and she knew it, felt it in every part of her that had spent the last month stretching every dollar, counting every cent, trying to make something out of almost nothing, and still falling short when it mattered most. Her gaze dropped to the ground, to the faint cracks in the pavement beneath her shoes, and she exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool air, as if she could release some of the pressure building inside her. But it lingered, heavy and unyielding, and for the first time since stepping outside, she felt something else creep in beneath the panic and the urgency, something quieter but just as powerful, a sense of being watched, not in the same way as inside the store, not with judgment or impatience, but with attention, steady and deliberate, and it made her shoulders tense slightly as she glanced over her shoulder without fully turning around, her eyes scanning the area behind her, the entrance, the rows of parked cars, the people coming and going, and for a brief moment, she caught sight of a figure near the doorway, standing still when others moved, someone who had not simply walked away, and even from this distance, something about that stillness felt different, intentional, like the moment inside had not ended for him the way it had for everyone else. And Hannah felt a flicker of unease mixed with confusion, because she did not know why anyone would still be paying attention, not after everything was already over, not after she had already walked away empty-handed. And yet, as she turned back toward the parking lot, trying to focus on what she needed to do next, she could not shake the feeling that whatever had started inside that store was not finished yet, not even close. Lucas Sterling had not planned to stop that day, not for groceries, not for anything. But the moment the coins hit the counter inside the store, something had pulled his attention in a way he could not ignore. And even now, standing just outside the sliding doors with his hands loosely at his sides, he found himself watching the woman he had seen at the register. The way she stood in the parking lot as if the ground beneath her feet was no longer steady, as if she was holding herself together by nothing more than willpower, and that alone was enough to make him pause, because he had seen many people in difficult situations before, had walked past them without a second thought more times than he could count. But this felt different, and he knew at the moment he heard the faint sound coming from her phone earlier, that sharp, desperate cry that did not belong in a place like that did not belong anywhere except in the arms of someone who could fix it. He exhaled slowly, his gaze narrowing just slightly as he watched her turn halfway, scanning the area behind her, and for a brief second their eyes almost met, but she looked away too quickly, her attention pulled back to whatever storm was building inside her, and Lucas remained where he was, still, composed, but far more focused than he had been minutes ago, his mind already moving through possibilities, through questions that had no clear answers yet, and the more he considered it, the more one thought settled in, simple and direct, that she should not be standing out there like that, not alone, not with whatever she was dealing with clearly escalating beyond a momentary problem at a checkout counter. He adjusted his stance slightly, glancing back through the glass doors into the store, where the line had already moved on, the moment erased as quickly as it had happened, and then his attention returned to her, to the way her shoulders were still tense, to the way her hands gripped her purse like it was the only thing anchoring her in place. And something about that detail, small as it was, triggered a quiet decision forming beneath the surface of his thoughts, one that did not rely on logic so much as instinct. The same instinct that had built everything he had, but rarely led him here, to a parking lot, watching a stranger struggle with something as basic and as urgent as feeding her child. He reached into his pocket without looking, pulling out his wallet as if the motion itself confirmed the direction he had already chosen, and then he started forward, his steps steady, deliberate, closing the distance between them without hesitation, because hesitation would only allow the moment to pass, and he was no longer willing to let it do that. Hannah heard the footsteps before she saw him, not loud, not rushed, but close enough to pull her attention back, and when she turned this time, fully, her eyes landed on him with a flicker of recognition, the man from the line behind her, the one who had said nothing while everything unfolded, and for a brief second she froze, uncertainty flashing across her face as she instinctively took a small step back, her grip tightening again around her purse, her body already preparing to protect what little space she had left. Lucas stopped a few feet away, keeping the distance intentional, his posture calm, non-threatening, but his presence alone carried a kind of certainty that made the moment feel heavier, more significant than it should have been. And when he spoke, his voice was even, controlled, but direct enough to cut through the noise of everything else around them. "You are going back in," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, one that seemed to settle into the space between them with quiet authority, and Hannah blinked, caught off guard by both the words and the certainty behind them, her immediate reaction rising to the surface before she could stop it. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head, her voice tighter now, defensive. "I am fine. I just need to get home." But even as she said it, the faint echo of her baby's cries still lingered in her ears, contradicting her in a way she could not hide, and Lucas did not move, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply watched her for a moment longer, taking in the exhaustion in her eyes, the strain in her expression, the truth she was trying to push down, and then he spoke again, just as steady as before, but this time with something deeper beneath the surface, something that made the words feel less like an observation and more like a line she could not step around. "Your baby needs that formula," he said quietly, and the way he said it made Hannah's breath catch, because it was not a guess, not really. It was a certainty, and for the first time since she walked out of that store, she realized that he had seen more than she thought, heard more than she wanted anyone to hear, and the situation she had tried to leave behind was no longer hers alone. Hannah shook her head again, more firmly this time, even as her chest tightened at his words, because hearing someone else say it out loud made everything feel more real, more exposed than she was ready to handle, and she took another small step back, putting just a little more space between them, her voice rising slightly as she tried to regain control of the situation. "I said I am fine," she repeated, though the steadiness she aimed for slipped at the edges, betraying the strain beneath it. "I do not need help. I just need to go." She turned as if to leave, her body already shifting toward the far end of the parking lot where the sidewalk led away, but she barely made it 2 steps before his voice stopped her again, not louder, not forceful, but certain in a way that made it impossible to ignore. "You do not have time to walk 15 blocks, Lucas said, his tone calm but precise, and Hannah froze mid-step, her breath catching as she turned back toward him, confusion flickering across her face, because she had not told him where she lived, had not said anything about distance, and yet he had said it like a fact, like something he already knew, and the realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice quieter now, cautious, her guard rising again as she studied him more carefully, noticing details she had not allowed herself to see before, the clean lines of his coat, the way he stood with quiet confidence, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And for a brief moment, something about him felt out of place in this parking lot, like he belonged somewhere else entirely. Lucas did not answer her question right away, his gaze steady as he took in the tension in her posture, the exhaustion in her eyes, the urgency she was trying and failing to hide. And when he finally spoke, his words did not explain, they redirected. "Because you would not still be standing here if you had another option," he said simply, And that hit closer than anything else he had said so far, because it was true, painfully so, and Hannah felt it settle into the space between them, stripping away the last bit of denial she had been holding on to. Her phone buzzed again, cutting through the moment like a sharp reminder, and this time she did not hesitate to answer, her hands shaking slightly as she brought it to her ear. "I am almost there," she said quickly, but the voice on the other end interrupted her before she could say anything more urgent now, more worried. "Hannah, his temperature feels higher. I think you need to come now." And the words landed hard, immediate, sending a surge of panic through her chest that made everything else fade for a second, including the man standing in front of her. "I am coming," she said, her voice breaking just slightly before she ended the call, her hand lingering on the phone for a moment as if she could hold on to it, as if it could somehow bring her closer to where she needed to be. She looked up again, her composure slipping now, the carefully held barrier cracking under the weight of everything pressing in at once. And for a second she did not speak, did not argue, did not try to push him away, because the urgency had finally overtaken her pride, and Lucas saw it, recognized the shift instantly, the moment where resistance gave way to necessity. He moved then, not abruptly, but with purpose, stepping past her toward the entrance of the store without waiting for permission, without asking again, and over his shoulder, he spoke in the same steady tone, but this time there was no room left for refusal. "Stay here," he said, and something in the way he said it made her pause instead of protest, made her hesitate instead of walk away, because for the first time since this started, someone was not just pointing out the problem, they were moving to solve it. And as she watched him disappear back through the sliding doors, a new kind of tension replaced the old one, quieter but just as intense, because now she was not just waiting for a solution, she was waiting to see what this stranger would actually do, and more importantly, why he was choosing to do it at all. Hannah remained where she was, her feet planted in place even though every instinct told her to move, to follow, to take control of the situation herself. But something about the way he had spoken, the quiet certainty in his voice, had interrupted that instinct just enough to hold her there, and now the seconds stretched longer than they should have, each one marked by the faint sound of automatic doors sliding open and closed behind the glass, people moving in and out as if nothing significant was happening at all, as if the world had not shifted for her in the last few minutes. Her hands tightened around her purse again, then loosened, then tightened once more, a restless motion she did not seem to notice, because her attention kept drifting back to the entrance, to the place where he had disappeared, and with each passing moment, doubt began to creep in, quiet at first, then louder, more insistent, because she did not know him, did not know anything about him beyond a brief moment at a checkout line and a few words in a parking lot, and yet she had stayed, had listened, had let him walk away with the assumption that he would return, and the realization of that made her shift her weight uneasily, her eyes scanning the parking lot again as if she could anchor herself in something familiar, something predictable. A car passed slowly behind her, the low hum of its engine cutting through the silence, and she stepped aside automatically, her gaze dropping for a second before lifting again toward the store, and that was when she saw him, not walking casually like any other customer, but moving with purpose, a shopping cart in front of him now. And for a moment her mind struggled to catch up with what she was seeing, because the cart was not empty, not even close, and as he pushed it through the doors and into the open air, the details became clearer, the bluekin stacked neatly inside, more than one, more than she had even considered buying, along with other items she had not had time to think about, small packages, essentials, things that spoke of preparation rather than desperation, and the sight of it made her take a small step forward without realizing it, her breath catching slightly as confusion and disbelief mixed together in a way she could not immediately sort through. Lucas did not slow as he approached, his focus steady, his movements efficient, and when he stopped in front of her, the cart between them, he did not present it like a favor, did not frame it as something she needed to thank him for. He simply reached into the cart, lifted one of the cans, and held it out toward her with the same calm certainty he had shown from the beginning. "This is the one you picked," he said, his voice even, as if confirming a detail rather than offering help, and Hannah stared at it for a second, the familiar blue label suddenly feeling heavier than it should, because it represented more than just what was inside. It represented the moment she had failed, the moment he had seen, the moment she had tried to walk away from, and now it was back in front of her again. But this time without the barrier of a price she could not meet. "I cannot take this," she said finally, her voice quieter now, but still carrying that same instinctive resistance, her head shaking slightly as she stepped back again, even as her eyes lingered on the can, even as the urgency she had been trying to contain pressed harder against her chest. Lucas did not pull his hand back, did not argue in the way she expected. He simply tilted his head slightly, studying her for a brief moment, and then he set the can back into the cart, his gaze never leaving her as he spoke again, his tone unchanged but his words shifting in a way that made the situation feel different, less like an offer and more like a decision already made. "Then do not take it," he said calmly, and for a split second, confusion flickered across Hannah's face, until he continued, his voice steady, almost matter of fact. "I am bringing it with me," he added, and the implication settled in immediately, clear and undeniable, making her breath catch again as she realized what he was saying without saying it directly, that whether she accepted it or not, he was not leaving without making sure it reached where it needed to go, and that shifted something in the space between them, something that made this moment feel less like a transaction and more like the beginning of something she did not yet understand, something she was not sure she was ready to face. Hannah stood there for a moment, the weight of his words settling into her chest in a way that made it hard to respond immediately, because he had shifted the situation again, taken away the simple option of refusing and walking away, and replaced it with something far more complicated, something that forced her to either accept his presence or confront the reality that she could not solve this alone. And that realization made her grip tighten around her purse once more as she looked at the cart, at the items inside, at the blue cans that represented the one thing she could not go home without, and then back at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find a reason, an explanation that would make this make sense. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, less defensive but still guarded, because the question mattered, more than the formula, more than the ride she knew she might have to accept next. It mattered because people did not just step into someone else's life like this without a reason, not without expecting something in return, and she needed to understand what that might be before she let this go any further. Lucas did not answer right away, his gaze steady as he studied her for a brief moment, as if weighing how much to say, or perhaps deciding that the reason itself was not the important part, and when he did speak, his words were simple, almost disarming in their directness. "Because you need it," he said, and the simplicity of that answer caught her off guard more than anything else he had done so far, because it did not come with conditions, did not come with explanation, it was just a statement of fact, and that made it harder to argue against, harder to reject without also rejecting the reality she was already facing. Her phone buzzed again, cutting through the moment with a sharp urgency that made her flinch slightly, and this time she did not even look at the screen before answering, her voice already tight with anticipation. "Tell me he is okay," she said quickly, but the pause on the other end stretched just long enough to make her heart race faster. Before the babysitter spoke, her voice lower now, more worried than before. "He is still crying, Hannah, and he feels warmer. I do not think you should wait any longer." And those words hit harder than anything else, sharper, more immediate, because they removed the last bit of time she thought she had, replaced it with a countdown she could not ignore, and Hannah closed her eyes for a brief second, the decision she had been avoiding pressing in from all sides until there was no space left to stand still. She lowered the phone slowly, her hand lingering for a moment before dropping to her side, and when she looked up again, something had shifted in her expression, the resistance still there, but no longer leading, no longer strong enough to override what needed to happen next, and Lucas saw it instantly, the subtle change in the way she held herself, the way her shoulders dropped just slightly as urgency took precedence over pride. He did not comment on it, did not push, he simply reached for the cart and turned it slightly toward the parking lot, his movements smooth, controlled, as if the next step had already been decided long before this moment. "Where is your car?" he asked, his tone steady, practical, and Hannah hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking her head, a small, almost reluctant motion that said more than words could have. "I walked," she admitted, her voice quieter now, and the admission seemed to settle something for him, confirming what he had already assumed. He nodded once, then gestured toward a sleek black sedan parked a short distance away, its presence understated but unmistakably out of place among the older vehicles surrounding it. And when he spoke again, there was no hesitation in his voice, no room for argument left in the way he framed the next step. "Then you are coming with me," he said, and Hannah felt her breath catch at the certainty in his tone, at the way the situation had moved beyond her control without ever feeling forced, because every step had been guided by something she could not deny, something she could not push away anymore. And as she looked from him to the car and back again, the weight of the decision settled fully, leaving her with only one choice that made sense. Even if she still did not understand the man standing in front of her, even if she still did not know what this would lead to, and that uncertainty lingered as she took a slow step forward, not toward the store this time, but toward him. The distance between them closed slowly, not because Lucas hesitated, but because Hannah did, her steps measured, cautious, as if each one required a decision she was not fully ready to make. And yet she kept moving, drawn forward by something stronger than doubt, something louder than the questions still lingering in her mind. And when they reached the car, the contrast hit her immediately. The polished black surface reflecting the dull gray of the parking lot around it, the quiet hum of the engine as it unlocked responding to his presence. Everything about it signaling a world far removed from the one she had been navigating. And for a brief moment she paused beside the passenger door, her hand hovering just above the handle as uncertainty flickered again. But then her phone buzzed once more, sharp and insistent. And that hesitation vanished almost instantly as she opened the door and slid into the seat without another word. The interior was warm, clean, carrying a faint scent of leather that felt unfamiliar to her, almost disorienting in contrast to everything else she had experienced that day, and she barely had time to register it before Lucas moved around the car, loaded the items quickly into the back seat, and took his place behind the wheel, his movements efficient, practiced, as if time itself was something he managed rather than followed. "Address," he said simply, glancing at her briefly, and Hannah gave it without hesitation this time, her voice steady despite the tension still sitting in her chest, because now there was no space left for second-guessing, no room for pride to interfere with what needed to happen next. The car pulled out of the parking lot smoothly, merging into the road with a quiet confidence that matched everything about him. And for a few moments, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the low sound of the engine and the faint rhythm of passing traffic. But inside Hannah, nothing was quiet, her thoughts moving rapidly, jumping between the present moment and the image of her baby at home, the sound of his crying still echoing in her ears, pushing her forward mentally even as the car carried her physically closer. She glanced once toward the back seat, toward the bag where the formula was now resting, and the sight of it brought a strange mix of relief and disbelief, because just minutes ago it had been out of reach, something she could not afford, and now it was there, secured, real, and yet the way it had come to her still did not make sense, still did not fit into anything she understood about how the world worked, and that tension lingered, quiet but persistent. "You should call them again," Lucas said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence but not disrupting it, his tone as steady as before, and Hannah nodded quickly, already reaching for her phone, dialing without looking at the screen, her fingers moving on instinct now, and when the call connected, she leaned slightly forward, as if that alone could close the distance faster. "I am on my way. I have it," she said immediately, the words coming out in a rush, and on the other end, the babysitter exhaled audibly, relief mixing with urgency. "Good. But Hannah, he is not settling. I think you need to hurry." And that single sentence tightened everything inside her again, turning the relief into pressure, into a countdown she could feel ticking with every passing second, and she nodded even though the other person could not see her. "We are almost there," she said, her voice quieter now, but more certain, because for the first time since this started, that statement felt true. She ended the call and sat back slightly, her hands still gripping the phone as she stared ahead through the windshield, watching the streets change as they moved further from the commercial area into older neighborhoods, the buildings less polished, the roads narrower, and Lucas noticed it too, The subtle shift in environment, the signs of wear, the details that told a story without needing explanation, and he said nothing, but his attention sharpened, his gaze more focused now, not just on the road, but on where it was leading, on the reality of the life she was returning to. The car slowed as Hannah finally spoke again, her voice low as she pointed ahead. "Turn left here," she said, and as the car followed her direction, the surroundings grew quieter, more worn, and for the first time since he stepped into this situation, Lucas began to see not just the moment in the store, not just the urgency in the parking lot, but the larger picture forming around it, piece by piece, and something about it made his grip on the steering wheel tighten just slightly. Because this was no longer just about helping a stranger in a moment of need, this was leading somewhere deeper, somewhere that raised more questions than answers, and he had the distinct sense that whatever he was about to walk into was not going to be simple, not for her, and not for him either. The car slowed to a stop in front of a narrow two-story building with peeling paint and a flickering porch light, the kind of place that blended into the background of the street, unnoticed unless you were looking for it. And Hannah was already reaching for the door handle before the engine fully idled, her movements quick, urgent, driven by the sound that seemed to echo louder in her mind with every passing second. And as soon as the door opened, the faint cry reached her, real this time, not through a phone, not filtered, but sharp and immediate from somewhere inside the building. And that was all it took for her to move, her steps fast, almost running toward the entrance as Lucas stepped out on the other side, grabbing the bag from the back seat without hesitation, his pace matching hers as they crossed the short walkway. The door opened before they even knocked, the babysitter standing there with worry written across her face, stepping aside quickly as Hannah rushed past her, her eyes already scanning the small living room until they landed on the tiny bundle in the bassinet near the couch. And the moment she reached him, everything else seemed to fade, her hands moving instinctively, lifting him gently, pressing him close as she murmured softly, her voice low and steady despite the tension still lingering in her chest. "I am here, it is okay," she whispered, even as she reached back for the bag Lucas held out, her fingers finding the can without needing to look, her movements practiced despite the urgency. And within moments she was preparing the bottle, her hands still trembling slightly, but steady enough to move through the routine she had repeated so many times before. Lucas remained near the doorway at first, his presence quiet, almost unnoticed against the small space. But his eyes moved carefully, taking in the details around him, the worn couch, the stack of unopened mail on the small table, the absence of anything that suggested comfort or ease, and something about it settled heavily, because it confirmed what he had already begun to understand, that this was not a temporary situation, not a single bad day, but a reality she had been carrying alone for far longer than this moment. The crying softened as the baby finally took the bottle, the sharp edge of it easing into something quieter, more manageable, and Hannah exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding for far too long, her shoulders dropping slightly as relief began to replace the panic. And for a moment she simply stood there, holding him close, her focus entirely on the small life in her arms, as if everything else could wait now that this had been solved. "Thank you," the babysitter said quietly from the side, glancing toward Lucas with a mix of gratitude and curiosity, but he only nodded once, his attention still on Hannah, on the way she held the baby, on the way the tension in her posture slowly began to unwind. And there was something about that image that held his focus longer than he expected, something familiar in a way he could not immediately place. Hannah adjusted the blanket slightly, her movements gentle, careful, and as she shifted, the edge of it slipped just enough to reveal a small detail that Lucas had not noticed before, a name stitched neatly into the corner in soft blue thread, simple, understated, but clear enough to read from where he stood, and for a moment, everything else seemed to narrow around that single word as his gaze fixed on it, his expression changing in a way that was almost imperceptible, but not entirely. "What is his name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, different from before, carrying something beneath the surface that had not been there until this moment. And Hannah looked up briefly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they arrived, her answer coming without hesitation, natural, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Noah," she said softly, her attention returning immediately to the baby in her arms, unaware of the way the name landed, unaware of the shift it caused, and Lucas stood there, still, his gaze lingering on the small embroidered letters, something tightening in his chest in a way he did not expect, because the name was not unfamiliar, not distant. It was something else entirely, something closer, something that carried a weight he could not ignore. And for the first time since this began, a new question formed, one that had nothing to do with a grocery store or a moment of kindness, but everything to do with the connection he had not seen coming. Because as he looked at the child, at the woman holding him, one thought surfaced clearly, impossible to push aside. Why does that name feel like it belongs to me?